Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulina Muhammad al-Amin. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Thank you for joining this discussion that we've been having and that we are now reaching the conclusion of. We have been discussing Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's counter-narrative with regard to religion and the state in Islam and his critique of the traditional narrative that's existed. In particular, we are looking at the 10 points that he raises in an article he wrote where he outlined his counter-narrative, and then a series of lectures he gave known as the Dallas Lectures in 2015, which explore in more detail these 10 points. And we've been trying to explore those here, bring them into the English language, since these were delivered, the article was written, and the lectures that he delivered were done in Urdu. So at this point now, we are at point number 9. We have 9 and 10 left. And the last point we discussed and we went into detail was this notion with regard to the social affairs of Muslims have to be determined by their consultation, and hence this sort of core democratic principle that exists as part of the discourse in Islam on religion and the state. And the traditional narrative has not really accepted this. But in Ghamdi's view, this is a core principle. And in fact, in his books, he explains how this principle around mutual consultation has been present from the very beginning, even though it got lost, at different stages in Islamic history. But during the time of the Prophet, or sort of subsequent to the Prophet in particular, this was present and very much alive within the Muslim community. So now we turn to the 9th point. And here, what we're going to do is really, because the 9th point, Ghamdi Sahib spends quite a lot of time elaborating on and giving sort of an initial background to. We're going to try to go through that, and then we'll get into the point itself and the 10th point, probably in the next 2 videos. So, a few facts that Ghamdi Sahib begins to bring out, or say that he wants to bring attention to before he delves into the 9th point. He says that in prior sessions, and we have sort of seen this in the sessions that we've been together for, that in prior sessions, the counter-narrative that has been proposed, Ghamdi Sahib says that he pointed out the fact that this counter-narrative and a solution to the traditional narrative cannot be secularism, right? A counter-narrative to the traditional narrative for Muslim society, right? For the discussion of religion and state as it pertains to Islam, as it pertains to Muslims and Muslim society, that the counter-narrative cannot be based and premised on secularism. It must come from religion, be based on religion, right? And here, he's used the word secularism and has said essentially that in a Muslim society, the idea of secularism is just not sustainable. It's not sustainable. He said right now, in Muslim society, there are religious scholars and a substantial number of people who agree with them, and their narrative is a traditional narrative. And then he says, in a society, let's say like Pakistan, for instance, there's a significant portion of the educated class, the educated elite, right? And this could apply in a place like Pakistan, but many other Muslim countries too, that there is a significant portion of the educated elite that have their own narrative as well, and that is secularism. That's what it's premised on. And Ghamdi Sahib says that up to this point, in his first 8 points, he has essentially put forward a counter-narrative that rejects the traditional narrative, the traditional positionality of our religious scholars. And on many of those points, he says, the secularists are in agreement with regard to the outcome, right? When Ghamdi says that Islam's directives are to the individual, or individuals who are in charge of the Muslim collective, etc., that the state is not an addressee of Islam, as is, would be commonly understood sort of in political science terms, etc. That in terms of the implications of some of the points that he has raised, that Ghamidi raised earlier, in terms of the implications, the proponents of secularism, he says, will sort of say, yeah, they'll be in agreement. They won't be in agreement with the method by which Ghamidi arrives at these implications, because for Ghamidi, that route is always religion. He is coming to his conclusions through religion, nothing outside of it. But he's coming to conclusions that the secularists are saying, yeah, we can agree with this. Right? So if they look simply at the implications or the conclusions or the consequences, then they're going to say, yeah, we're arriving at the same place, and they'll ignore the religious reasoning that Ghamidi puts forward to get there. And what he's talking about, of course, when he's speaking about the state, he says, is the notion of the modern nation state, one that he didn't really have a hand in creating, but that has come about through historical processes. Right? And oftentimes he says there are certain scholars, he says there was a response to his counter-narrative by Mufti Taqi Usmani, for instance, who sort of highlighted and said, well, look, Ghamdi's narrative is full of contradictions. And why is it? Because he starts with the idea of the state having no religion, and then later ends up mentioning a number of religious directives that are speaking to the Muslim collective. For Mufti Taqi Usmani, how is this that these two things can exist at the same time? That you have a state with no religion, but then you have religious directives that speak to the governing of the affairs of the Muslim collective. And in reply, Ghamidi wrote in another article that what we must understand is that the state is one thing and the government is another. For example, says, we can be citizens of the Pakistani state or citizens of the American state, while at the same time, the government can be Democratic or Republican here in the United States, or from the PPP or PML or Imran Khan's party in the Pakistani state, or whatever else. That those are two distinct things. That the government can come with its own viewpoints, distinct viewpoints, and vision. If a party gets the mandate to govern, then, if they get the mandate to govern, if the public gives them this mandate, then they have the right to propose any law to the country. But they don't have a right over the state itself, right? The state belongs to everybody. The government may belong to the Democratic Party, but the United States of America does not belong to the Democrats. So that distinction, he says, is important. The state does not belong to any single party, even if they come to power through the majority. Only the government belongs to them. The state, he says, cannot belong to just one religious outlook either. As a result, he says, look, I've gone into detail explaining the different types of states that have existed, the one in the Arabian Peninsula, and its nature was determined by God. Another type of state that came about through conquest, where there's ruler-rule dynamics. But modern nation states are not built on these principles of ruler-ruled, etc. In these states, the debate will be around governance, and Islam has provided certain directives about governance. In other words, those who end up governing over Muslims are given certain directives from God. Right? What he is saying here is the state has no religion, but that doesn't mean that the people who come into power or who are chosen to rule over Muslims, that they have to have no religion as well. Right? The state doesn't need to convert to Islam. But if a Muslim happens to decide to run for election, be elected, that is perfectly legitimate. that the government can have individuals who are devoted to a particular faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that that changes the tenor of the state to reflect that one particular religion. So what he says here is, as he's noted before as well, Muslim majority countries, for instance, can create a united Muslim nation of some kind if they want, as a political matter, but not as a religious directive. You can desire this, but you're not religiously obligated to establish, for instance, a caliphate, right? In all of these matters that he's explained, the secularists are happy. They're happy with the outcomes that he's coming to, right? But what they don't understand is that Ghamidi Sahib does not look at religion through the lens of liberalism or secularism. Ghamidi Sahib looks at the world through the lens of religion. Right? That his approach and where he's coming to arrive at these conclusions that proponents of secularism might be in agreement with is from a completely different direction. Right? So when he discusses the first 8 points out of the 10 as part of the counter-narrative, you can get the distinct sense that many of those outcomes suit secularism. And I'm not going to go through all of those because we've done them in these past lectures. That all those consequences, outcomes are secular. But the reasoning remains religious. And so when we get to this 9th point, Ghamidi Sahib says, now is when he gets into conflict with the secularists. So he rejects the traditional narrative point by point through the first 8 points. Right? And the traditionalists, the religious sort of individuals, those folks who are wedded to the traditional narrative are diametrically opposed to Ghamidi's views on the first 8. Right? But here, when we get to the 9th point, Ghamidi differs with the secularists by saying a Muslim society can never be secular. A Muslim society can never be secular. A question, he says, might come to mind here, or come to the forefront, that if Islam has not given any directives concerning Muslim collective life, then does it mean that Islam is just personal, like Christianity? If there was no directives pertaining to Muslim collective life or to the rulers who govern over collective life, then Ghamidi said he would have brought this forth. And then you could totally say that there is no difference between Ghamidi's position and secular liberalism. Because the secularists, the liberals, believe that there should be no religious directives governing collective life. But this is not Ghamidi's position, right? This is not Ghamidi's position. He does not use secularism or liberalism as part of his justification. The only time he raises those terms is really to reject them. Right? And it sometimes is difficult for folks because they want to put Ghamidi in one box or the other. They either want him to be an Islamist who is devoted to the traditional narrative that's after the caliphate, or they want him to be a secularist who doesn't believe that religion has any role in the state. And he's neither of those. He's neither of those. The question that comes up is, does Islam give any directives related to Muslim collective life? And if it does, what are these directives? And how do they relate to the state? How do they relate to government? If a Muslim government, he says, was to establish itself at some point, can it be completely divorced from religion? Can it be completely divorced from religion? And if it can be, then that is essentially what proponents of secularism are suggesting. But Ghamidi does not accept this at all. Right? For Ghamidi, Islam does give directives pertaining to Muslim collective life. And in addition to that, if a Muslim government is established, at some point, it cannot be completely divorced from religion because the individuals who will be sort of the representatives of the people there, who will be ruling over them or in power over them, that they will have certain religious directives with regard to Muslim collective life that they'll be responsible for. People must decide. He goes back to this point. He says people must decide what type of government they wish to establish. You cannot impose a view on people from beforehand, right? And human beings evolve in their views, etc. And this is why there's no one type of state that can be imposed on people for perpetuity, right? Forever. It's a nation state right now, or type of republic, right? It could be something different in the future if people so choose. But for the current moment, it's a world of nation states that we live in, and whose nationality we adopt, who we identify with, and Islam has no objection to this, as we've talked about in a previous session with regard to Islam does not have to be the nationality of a territory. You can have other nationalities and identities, right? But if a Muslim state arises, do they have any religious directives that they must keep in mind, right? That they must keep in mind. Now, there are going to be people who will be, Ghamidi says, there are going to be some types of secularists who essentially have no real belief in religion at all, and they just kind of are uninterested in it completely. There are going to be others, though, who are devout Muslims in their individual life, right? Who pray, fast, etc., but believe that when it comes to the collective life, right, and when it comes to the nation state, then it must be secular in the ultimate sense of the word. And for Ghamidi, this position and these people are incorrect in this view, if examined from an Islamic perspective. And more importantly, their goal to say that every nation state, even where it's sort of a Muslim society, should be secular, that this is essentially a losing battle. Right? It's a losing battle. They can never achieve this objective. The fundamental mistake, he says, that they make is that when secularism and liberalism arose in the West, right, the target from the standpoint of religion was Christianity. But what had happened to Christianity up to that point? What Ghamidi says is, in the case of Christianity, there had already been a sort of revolution centuries prior, and not too far after the time of Jesus, peace be upon him, that there had been a kind of revolution that had occurred in the person of St. Paul that had transformed Christianity. And how it had done that, what it had done is that it had taken the law of the Torah and disassociated it from the religion of Christianity. Hence, he says, the secular liberal fight against Christianity was not actually a fight just against Christianity. It was truly a fight against the church as an institution that now had political power, right? The church itself, Ghamidi says, had no argument, no religious argument for its existence, because the law of the Torah had been separated from sort of the Christian religion. The church itself had no religious argument for its existence. It was simply a traditional institution that had remained intact. And in this traditional institution, when it came to the stage where sort of secularism was being sort of pushed to battle against the church, what people imagined that was a battle against Christianity, Ghamidi says, no, it was a battle against the church, a church that had over time given tremendous power to the Pope, tremendous political power to the Pope, and religious people had essentially gained a tremendous amount of political power. And that is what the secularism was fighting against. In the Muslim community, the kind of closest semi-equivalent to this, in some respects, are the type of power, special political powers, Ghamidi says, that certain areas of the Shi'i community will give, right? That will be religious people, religious scholars will be endowed with particular political power within the Shi'i discourse, right? So that exists in some way. And we see that gaining kind of constitutional status, he says, in the case of Iran, of course. Right? Not the only Shi'i country, but kind of a major representative. And there you see sort of that melding, the merging of political power and religious sort of leadership together in a microcosm of kind of what existed previously with the Pope. And that, essentially, the secular battle that happened in the West was against that papacy, the institution of the papacy, the church, which had no religious basis. And in fact, he says that the church just ended up being, in Ghamdi's view, a form of subjugating other human beings. And as a result, it was unable to overcome the opposition from proponents of secularism, etc., because it simply didn't have that type of organic support within its population, because a religious population, there was no religious basis for it. And so slowly it agrees, unsurprisingly for Ghamdi, to confine itself to the Vatican, to give up mostly all of its power. There was no religious argument to support it. Maybe, he says, if the law of the Torah had still been operative, then this separation, not just maybe, he says, it would not have been possible if the law of the Torah was still there and connected to the Christian faith, then this type of separation between church and the state would not have been possible, according to Ghamdi. But he says this Christian psyche had parted ways from Judaic law to the extent that even the directives relating to individual life, let alone directives related to collective life, were not being followed by Christians, right? That they were no longer beholden to the law of the Torah. So in that sense, then, there was no real difficulty that arose for Europeans who wanted to separate the church from the state. The problem, he says, for proponents of secularism among Muslims and in Muslim society, as they are trying to view things from this European perspective, from this European experience. But in the context of Muslim society, he says, you still have to deal with the Quran. You still have to deal with the Quran. In the past 14 centuries, no one in the Muslim world has even dared to create an institution like the Catholic Church, or that someone has declared and it be accepted by the masses that there is no law in Islam. Like, no one's dared to do that. And if you look at the Quranic content, it contains ethics, it contains creed, but another essential part of the Quran is the law, is the Sharia. Right? Anyone who reads this law will see that while the vast majority of it relates to individuals, there are parts that relate to society, to government, to the Muslim collectivity and those in charge of it. And we don't just have the Quran, he says, in translation. We have it in its original language, its original form. It's recited in every Muslim home. It's the place that countless people go to better understand their faith. It is constantly engaged in some way or the other by Muslims and Muslim society. So who then could imagine removing the Quran from the Muslim psyche? Who could imagine doing something equivalent to the removal of the law of the Torah from the Christian religion? He says that process that was essential to allow for secularism to overcome the church, the Catholic Church, the papacy and its political power. Who could imagine doing some similar type of process with regard to the Quran? It's just simply not possible. And he says, if you look at Turkey, where secularism was made the state religion and given the full backing of the state's coercive power, it was a complete failure. And he says it's going to fail anywhere else as well. Because the reason is, the actual fight is not between a pope and the people in the Islamic context. That's what it was, he says, in the Christian context. It was a fight between a pope, a religious leader that had been given political power but has no religious justification for that, and the people. In the Islamic context, what you are doing is you are proposing with sort of this proponents of secularism are essentially proposing that there's going to be a fight between the Quran and the people. And if you try, Ghamdi says, to get the people to fight the Quran, you will fail. You will fail. And he says he's tried to explain this to secularists, that while he is standing in a position of belief, when he rejects the secular Muslim state, even from a political perspective. So Ghamdi's rejection of the secular state, he says, is coming from religion itself. He says it's just not possible. But he says, even from a political perspective, even from a strategic perspective, it's a losing proposition. Right? And he says it's funny because the secularists on certain issues, at least in sort of the context of Pakistan, when it comes to, for instance, religious directive relating to jihad, they will want the state to interfere. They'll want the state to be involved there, to curtail jihad, to take ownership over the religious directive with regard to jihad. But if you are saying that the state is not going to interfere in the collective life of Muslims in any religious way, if it's not going to sort of act on any of the religious directives to collective life that exists within Islam, Ghamidi Sahib is asking, well, how are you expecting it to do so in the context of jihad? What right would they then have if I decide I wish to fulfill this religious directive regarding jihad and I've formed my own battalion, I'm going off to war? What right would they then have to intervene? Right? If you are looking at this. And he says, surely people will do that because that is a directive that exists. In a Muslim society, he says, you cannot put an end to fighting. You cannot put an end to conflict. You cannot handle many of these issues without reference to religion. Fundamentally, Ghamidi is saying, religion must have a role in the counter-narrative, no matter what. You cannot premise a counter-narrative outside of religion to deal with the traditional religious narrative in Muslim society. Any such counter-narrative that does not take account for religion, that is not based on religion, that is not justified on religion, that does not formulate religious arguments, is going to fail in Muslim society for the reasons that he has outlined. In the final session coming up, we are going to then look at his 9th and 10th point as part of the counter-narrative and conclude our discussion with regard to religion of the state and the counter-narrative that Javed Ghamidi has put forward. Wa akhir ad-dawa.